Hi, everybody. My name is Devin Main, and today I'm going to be doing a Zoom presentation of the Harlem Renaissance. Unfortunately, due to district policy, I am not allowed to record this meeting with students in it. So I will be sort of presenting this lesson as if I was speaking to a classroom full of students. So from this point forward, I'm going to be acting as if I'm teaching my lesson to a classroom full of students. Starting now. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Mr. Main, and today we will be doing an interactive read-aloud of the Harlem Renaissance that occurred during the Roaring '20s. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We are going to be on page 400 of the textbook. I'm using the online textbook on the HMH website. And again, this lesson is titled The Harlem Renaissance. So many of you might be asking, what's the point of the Harlem Renaissance? Why are we learning about this? Well, the big idea of today's lesson is that African-American ideas, politics, art, literature, and music flourished in Harlem and elsewhere in the United States. So the Harlem Renaissance was this period during the Roaring '20s in which Black art and Black culture was really able to flourish. So, why does this matter now? Why are we learning about this? Well, the Harlem Renaissance provided a foundation of African-American intellectualism to which African-American writers, artists, and musicians contribute today. So most of the music that we listen to today is largely influenced by jazz music, which was really popularized by these Black musicians during the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of literature was also largely influenced by these Black writers during the Harlem Renaissance as well. So we're going to go to the section in this book titled The Harlem Renaissance Flowers in New York. Right, so the Harlem Renaissance flowers in New York. So, this is called the Harlem Renaissance. Why Harlem? Well, it's called the Harlem Renaissance because it largely took place in Harlem of New York City. Harlem was located on the Upper West Side of New York's Manhattan Island. And this is really the location in which many Black citizens in the United States lived at the time. Many African Americans had migrated to these northern cities during the 1910s to 1920s. As we went over in our lesson on World War I, the reason why we had this large large migration rate of African Americans into these big cities, especially like New York City, was largely because the job opportunities which were becoming available in the United States during the World War I. Another reason why many African Americans moved to New York and other large cities in the North was to escape that racial persecution that they were facing in the South. Remember, as a result of those Jim Crow laws in the South, which largely segregated African Americans from white citizens, it also would restrict the rights of African Americans in the United States. Oftentimes, their voting rights are restricted, so they weren't really allowed to vote. And many other rights were sort of stripped away from them. And one of these places which really formed this African American community was Harlem of New York City. Because like I said, many African Americans would move to the North during World War I, and this is really when Harlem started to take shape and become this African American community, which would give many African Americans this community which allowed their art to thrive and flourish. Many of these residents who lived in Harlem came from the South of the United States, the West Indies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Haiti. So we're going to read a quote right now by James Weldon Johnson, who was an African-American leader of the NAACP. If we remember, the NAACP is that organization dedicated to establishing racial equality in the United States because our country was not equal. Black citizens were mistreated and discriminated against on a constant basis in our country. So this quote is by James Weldon Johnson describing what Harlem meant to him and what he viewed Harlem as. And as we read this quote, I do want to point out some terms that are used in this quote aren't really used in today's world because they aren't appropriate in today's terminology. But when we look at these quotes and we read through them, we need to understand the historical context of them. These quotes were said in a time period in which certain terms were widely used or widely accepted. But as we go through time, we learn more appropriate terms to use and we sort of change our terminology. So let's go ahead and read this. So James Weldon Johnson, he says, Harlem is not merely a Negro colony or community. It is a city within a city, the greatest Negro city in the world. It is not a slum or a fringe. It is located in the heart of Manhattan and occupies one of the most beautiful sections of the city. It has its own churches, social and civic centers, shops, theaters, and other places of amusement. And it contains more Negroes to the square mile than any other spot on earth. So James Weldon Johnson is describing this place of Harlem as this community in which African Americans were able to showcase their artistic talents. It was a location in which their art was able to thrive. So again, this was the Harlem Renaissance, all right? And the Harlem Renaissance, it was a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. So the Harlem Renaissance was a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. So why Harlem? Why is it called the Harlem Renaissance? And why did this occur specifically in Harlem? Well, let's look at Harlem in the 1920s. New York's Harlem neighborhoods, it was largely about apartment housing and many entertainment centers as well. And the reason why a Black community formed in Harlem was because African American realtors, they bought a lot of property in Harlem and they leased this property to other African Americans who were eager to live in this growing neighborhood. So many African Americans who would move from the South would purposely try to live in this community in Harlem because it was this community which was really shaping in which an African American community was forming, in which Black art was able to thrive and flourish. Let's look into a map of what Harlem looked like, and it might try to observe this and look for reasons why you may think that Harlem specifically allowed Black art to thrive. Why would the Harlem Renaissance take place in Harlem in particular? Let's look at this map and try to reason why it took place in Harlem. One of the locations of Harlem, which allowed this venue in which Black artists were able to showcase their talents, was the Cotton Club, right? So the Cotton Club, which is right here, it was this venue, this entertainment club in Harlem, in which many Black performers like Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith frequently performed at. This club would be usually packed by many people to listen to these, Black performers who were very innovative of their time. Duke Ellington was one of the most innovative jazz musicians of his time, and Bessie Smith was an extraordinary singer who was widely known across the entire nation. Let's get into this other location right here called the Savoy Ballroom, right? So the Savoy Ballroom, and again, if you're not sure where we are, we're right here. I'm going to go ahead and highlight over it, the Savoy Ballroom. So the Savoy Ballroom was another one of these famous night spots, which was located on Lenox Avenue. It was oftentimes called the heartbeat of Harlem, and it was in operation from 1926 to 1958. Another famous location was the Lafayette Theater, which is about right here in the middle of the map. The Lafayette Theater, it was another important venue which allowed Black artists a spotlight to perform and showcase their talents. The Lafayette Theater was actually the first New York theater to be desegregated. And there would be crowds of people packing this theater every night. Now let's get into one of these last locations on the map that I want to go over, the Apollo Theater. Many of you are probably already familiar with the Apollo Theater. You may have heard of this Apollo Theater at some point in your life. So let's get into, what the Apollo Theater was. The Apollo Theater, it was another entertainment center in which Black artists were able to showcase their talents. People like Ella Fitzgerald performed here, and it was really a place in which many African American performers would launch their careers. So throughout Harlem, we had a lot of these, entertainment centers like the Apollo Theater, like Lafayette Theater, the Savoy Ballroom, and the Cotton Club. They really allowed these Black artists to showcase their own talents, and it was located in this predominantly Black community in Harlem. So I'm going to pose a question to all of you. The question that I want to ask you is right here. It asks, what factors seem to have helped make Harlem a close-knit neighborhood in the 1920s? What factors seem to have helped make Harlem a close-knit neighborhood in the 1920s? So right here, what I would do is I would use a random number generator to call on a few students to answer the question. I'll give students, a moment to think about the question, and then I'll go to my random number generator. I'll show it to students. Then I'll generate a few numbers. I'd call on student number 5 down my roster sheet. I'd also call on a couple other students. I go to student number 24, and then I'll pick a third number and call on student number 3. This is a way for me to randomly select students, so I'm getting a wide range of responses throughout the entire reading. So I'm not having the same students over and over respond to it. It's also to keep them on edge to make sure they are paying attention because their name can be called at any moment. So once I get my responses from students, I will go ahead and review this with the rest of the class. I'll review the generated response that comes with the book. So, what factors seem to have helped make Harlem a close-knit neighborhood in the 1920s? Well, it was a densely populated area of mostly Black residents. 2 African-American leaders lived there, and several entertainment opportunities made it a lively neighborhood. So now let's get into specific individuals of the Harlem Renaissance, which really allowed the Harlem Renaissance to thrive and really made the Harlem Renaissance take its shape. Let's move on to this subsection right here titled African American Writers. All right, so African American writers. So the Harlem Renaissance produced a lot of great literature by African Americans in the United States. One of the most important themes that these Black writers wrote about was the trials of being Black in a white world. All right, so the trials of being Black in a white world. What does this mean? What does it mean when it talks about this theme of being Black in a white world? Well, like we've gone over throughout our entire class, African Americans in the United States were discriminated against on a daily basis and almost at every single moment in American history up to this point still. At the beginning of American history, African Americans were slaves for the most part. There were only a few who had freedom. After the Civil War ended, there were Jim Crow laws which were put into place, which restricted the rights of many African Americans. Segregated African Americans, stripped their right of voting away from them. So Black citizens were constantly facing discrimination and racism in the United States based off the color of their skin. Not that white citizens never had to experience any hardships, but the difference between the hardships Black citizens faced versus the hardships white citizens faced was white citizens never had to worry about being discriminated against based off of the color of their skin like Black citizens had to worry about. So these writers during the Harlem Renaissance really start to put a spotlight on this issue of growing up Black in this world, in this country that has shown them hate almost throughout their entire lives. One of these artists which really came into popularity during the Harlem Renaissance was Claude McKay. Claude McKay, he was a novelist, poet, and Jamaican immigrant who was a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He wrote about the pain of life in Black ghettos and the strain of being Black in a world dominated by whites. He really urged his readers to resist prejudice and discrimination, and he did this through his literary works. Another famous author of the Harlem Renaissance was Jean Toomer. Jean Toomer wrote this experimental book called Cain, which was a mix of poems and sketches about Blacks in the North and the South. It was actually one of the first full-length literary works of the entire Harlem Renaissance. Perhaps the best-known author of the Harlem Renaissance, though, was Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was the movement's best-known poet. And what he really did was he described the lives of working-class African Americans. And he really gained international fame for his literary works. And his poems would actually influence African American writers in future generations. Didn't just influence African American writers, but really poetry in general. Because his poetry oftentimes would actually go with the rhythm of jazz. Right? So he had sort of a jazz rhythm to his poetry, which in a lot of ways really encapsulated his readers, really made his readers pay attention to the poems and really get in awe of it. So we're going to read this poem right now by Langston Hughes. It's one of his most famous poems, which he actually wrote as a teenager. And this poem is titled, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." So Langston Hughes writes, "I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world, and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers." This is a very powerful poem by Langston Hughes, which was published in The Crisis in 1921. So I'm going to pose a question to you all again. I want you to analyze this poem. Look into specific parts. This question asks, what does Hughes achieve by referring to the Euphrates, Congo, and Nile rivers? Langston Hughes speaks of many rivers throughout this entire poem. What is the point of him mentioning these rivers? Why is he talking about the Euphrates? Why is he talking about the Congo? Why is he talking about the Nile? Why does he then go on to move to the Mississippi and talk about New Orleans? What is the point of him talking about these rivers? So again, what does Hughes achieve by referring to the Euphrates, Congo, and Nile rivers? So again, I would go to my random number generator and pick a random student to respond to these questions. Let's pick a few students. So right here, I would get student number 24. Then I'd get student number 17, and then student number 27. I'd ask these students to send me a response either via the text entry box or allow them to raise their hand, and then I will choose them to respond to the question via the audio in Zoom. Once I receive the responses from the students and responses from other volunteers, I will go ahead and share the textbook response. And the textbook says, "He insinuates the connection that African Americans share with the ancient civilizations through which the rivers flowed." So Langston Hughes in this poem, he is describing the heritage of Black people in the world. He is saying that Black people have been around since the beginning of time. And really what he is trying to say is that Black people should take pride in themselves, be proud of who they are. Despite the country constantly giving them hate, he is saying that they should be proud of who they are, and they shouldn't be ashamed of who they were born as. Let's continue on. Another one of the famous authors of the Harlem Renaissance was Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston often portrayed the lives of poor, unschooled Blacks. She really talked about more of the folk people. She talked more about the lives of Southern Blacks. That was the main part of her literature during the Harlem Renaissance, talking more about the common person. Now let's move on away from talking about literature and let's talk about these African American performers. The Harlem Renaissance not only was important due to the African American literature, which really started to gain fame, but also due to specific African American performers, which began to become famous during the 1920s. Langston Hughes himself actually says that the Harlem Renaissance, the movement, launched with the Black musical comedy Shuffle Along. So Shuffle Along, like I said, it was a Black musical comedy that was very popular in 1921. The Shuffle Along musical, what it did was it really spotlighted the talents of several Black performers, including the singers Florence Mills, Josephine Baker, and Mabel Mercer. Another important performer, Black performer of the 1920s was Paul Robeson. All right, Paul Robeson, he was the son of a one-time slave, and he was a major dramatic actor. He actually performed in Shakespeare's Othello in London and New York City, where he won acclaim. He was widely popular for his great performances in Shakespeare's Othello. He also argued for racial equality in the United States, and he was a supporter of the Communist Party, which would end up leading him to be blacklisted. So he wasn't able to perform in many theaters around the world due to his support for the Communist Party, due to the Red Scare that was going on, that fear of communism. So now let's look into how African Americans really influenced music, right? So let's get into this next subsection, African Americans and jazz. So jazz was really born in the early 20th century in New Orleans, but it would become widely popular in Harlem, and Harlem would really help put a big spotlight on jazz music, which would help jazz music become popular nationwide. One of these famous jazz musicians was Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was a very talented trumpeter, and he really gained nationwide recognition for his ability as a trumpeter playing this jazz music. Louis Armstrong was really famous for his sense of rhythm and his ability to improvise, right? He was really able to improvise, which allowed him to sort of make his own personal expression a key part of jazz. And that would actually be a very important part to most jazz musicians, was their ability to provide their own personal expression. Jazz music, like I said, became popular and very fashionable throughout the entire 1920s, which is why the 1920s are often called the Jazz Age. One of the other famous jazz musicians of the 1920s was Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington, he was a famous jazz pianist and composer. He actually had a 10-piece orchestra that would frequently play at the Cotton Club, and he became one of the most well-known jazz musicians in the entire country. He would gain nationwide recognition for his ability as a composer. This is actually a picture of Duke Ellington. Many of you might already be familiar with him. You may have even heard some of his works and his, you may have heard him and his orchestra play. He was one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Not just one of the greatest Black composers, but one of the greatest American composers of the entire 20th century, who was Black and really helped popularize jazz music. Another one of these famous jazz musicians was Cab Calloway. He was a talented drummer, saxophonist, and singer. He also helped, along with Louis Armstrong, popularize this style of jazz, which would be known as scat, which was singing using sounds instead of words. Another famous jazz musician or not really jazz musician, but another famous musician of the 1920s and during the Harlem Renaissance was Bessie Smith. She was a blues singer, which was slightly different from jazz. So Bessie Smith, she was one of the most outstanding vocalists of the entire decade and was a very key part to the Harlem Renaissance because she would gain nationwide recognition as one of the nation's greatest singers. She achieved enormous popularity throughout the 1920s and would eventually become the highest paid Black artist in the entire world. Another one of these famous musicians, another one of these famous African American musicians was Josephine Baker. She actually largely lived in Paris, where she would wow French audiences with her singing, dancing, and comedy. So now let's look into what these musicians look like. All right, so you can kind of get a sense of who these musicians are. This is a picture of Cab Calloway, who was that very talented drummer and saxophonist who was very, famous and really popularized jazz music. This is a picture of Louis Armstrong, who was that very talented trumpeter who was known for his ability to improvise in his solo and add his own personal expression in his music. This is a picture of Bessie Smith, who was one of the greatest singers of the 20th century. She had a great voice, and she was known throughout the entire nation and would become the highest paid singer, Black singer in the entire world. And this is a picture of the Hot Five. We didn't go over them yet, but Louis Armstrong was in this band. The Hot Five would oftentimes make the music for the singer's lyrics when these singers would record a song. They were often the ones who were making the music for those singers. And this is a picture of Josephine Baker. She was largely lived in France most of her life, and she was that famous singer, dancer, and actress. She really had an ability to make people laugh with her acting, and she had a great voice with also this amazing ability to dance. So now let's move away from these musicians, and let's move into African American artists. All right, so African American artist. All right, we're going to get into some of these sculptors and some of these painters of the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, one of these painters or sculptors was Richmond Barth. He actually created a monument that was dedicated to Haitian hero Toussaint Louverture. He also created a portrait statue of Booker T. Washington. He was a very famous sculptor, which really helped bring a spotlight to African American art. Aaron Douglas was also another famous artist during the 1920s and during the Harlem Renaissance. He painted murals and illustrated books and magazines. Let's go ahead and look at one of these paintings of Aaron Douglas. So this is a painting in which Aaron Douglas made. As you see, there are many things going on in this painting by Aaron Douglas. We see right here in the forefront, we have this jazz musician. We see the saxophone, which is basically in reference to the jazz age during the Harlem Renaissance. We also see the Statue of Liberty in the background, along with these skyscrapers of New York City and possibly other cities, these big northern cities as well. And this is sort of a call to the Great Migration. So this painting is talking about a lot, and specifically, it's focusing on the Harlem Renaissance and how many Black citizens moved away from the South and moved towards the North. And we also saw this jazz style, which widely became coincided with these Black musicians. So let's go ahead and summarize this lesson. And what is the Harlem Renaissance about? What was its enduring influence? All right. So let's get into the enduring influence of the Harlem Renaissance. One of the reasons why the Harlem Renaissance was so important was because it put African Americans on the country's cultural stage. The Harlem Renaissance, it really showcased the talents of many African American artists in the country. And it really inspired many African Americans to take a new pride in themselves, to appreciate the chief achievements of many of these Black artists during the Harlem Renaissance. And it also inspired many other Black artists to either create their own music, develop their own pieces of literature, paint their own murals. It really inspired a whole new generation of Black artists, which continues to influence art to this day. A lot of the music we listen to today is inspired by jazz. Aaron Douglas really created this modern style of painting, which inspired many artworks in the future. And this, literature that was written during the Harlem Renaissance, especially, by people like Aaron Douglas, not Aaron Douglas, by Langston Hughes, would really inspire many other Black writers throughout the 20th century, specifically during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which we're going to get on later on in this class. So what I want to do is ask you all one last question. How did writers, musicians, and artists of the Harlem Renaissance affect American culture and values? So how did writers, musicians, and artists of the Harlem Renaissance affect American culture and values? Again, right here, what I would do is I would go to my random number generator and call on a few students to answer the question. Right here, I selected student 2 down my roster sheet, student 9, and also student 10. And again, this is to get a wide range of perspectives. And so students stay engaged because their name could be called at any moment throughout the reading. I also let some volunteers speak what they think as well, so they have an opportunity if they would like to share their thoughts as well. And then after I get those responses, we spend a few minutes talking about this. I'll go to the actual response that is written in the book and show it to them all. So the textbook says, they demonstrated that African Americans had remarkable skills and talents and should be valued as equal members of American society. These Black artists, these Black musicians, these Black performers, these Black writers, they showcased that African Americans had just as much talent and skill as white Americans in the United States, which many didn't believe. Many believed that Black citizens just weren't capable of doing as much as white citizens. And this really helped change that perspective and really start to show that African Americans were extremely talented as well. And they were capable of producing these great pieces of artistic work. So that is the end of this lesson. Thank you for following along with it, and I do appreciate it. So thank you.